Alrighty, so we are ready to start the next session, which is the amazing Martin Laplante. How do I pronounce your name?
Laplante.
Laplante, of course. That's that's the way it should be.
Pronounce it whichever way you like.
So you're going to talk about this very fresh, new multilingual page publishing option in SharePoint Online.
That's what I'm going to do.
That's cool. I'm really interested because I think that was like released in the last month or 2 months ago.
I don't think it's rolled out in general availability yet. I think it's still in targeted release.
Ah, okay, but then they're still behind schedule, I guess, because I do think it was the intent to roll it out in April, if I'm not mistaken.
The schedule changed several times.
Yeah. All right. Before I give the mic to you, I see that you have the video pop-up of me that you can you can remove that from your shared screen.
There we go.
And then the stage is yours. You're ready to go.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So I'm Martin Laplante. I'm CEO of Pointfire. This is my personal Twitter handle. This is going to be a non-commercial talk. I'm not going to talk about the companion product that we have that works with this. For that, you'll have to go to the booth. So let's start with some of the introductory slides and animations that you've seen a couple of times before. So this is the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference, March 23rd. And here are all the sponsors. You know about the raffle, giving away 3 Oculus Quest all in one. So in this session, I'm going to talk about a bunch of stuff. And what might happen is that I run out of time and skip some of the last things. I always have more stuff that I can fit in 50 minutes. So we're going to talk about the new topology, which means that language is being handled at a different organizational level, and what that means in terms of governance. I'm going to give a very disappointing demo. I promise you will be disappointed in this first demo of a feature that doesn't work like you might think that it does. Then I'm going to give a good demo, and the good demo is going to be a long demo of the multilingual page publishing feature, the new feature. I'll talk about some of the other multilingual features in SharePoint, the MUI, manage metadata. I'll talk about what happens, what that means in terms of governance. I'll talk about some of the Teams multilingual features. And then if there's time, I'll talk about the new generation of machine translation products that Microsoft has brought out. So a lot of stuff. But before we start, once upon a time, large international organizations used to have separate SharePoint farms in different countries. So you'd have a farm in Europe, a farm in North America. You may have farms in different countries. What that meant is that each farm or each site collection would be the one to decide about issues having to do with language. Then came Office 365 with tenants. And the question was, should there be a single tenant for everyone or several regional tenants, mimicking the structure that they used to have with separate farms in different regions? Sometimes there are laws that talk about where you can store data legally. Sometimes there are worries about network latency. But the problem with separate tenants is that the boundaries between tenants are impenetrable. You can't share between different tenants. They might as well be competitors. Multi-geo is something that lets you, within a single tenant, determine the data residency of the data of different sites, different people within the same tenant. So all the arguments that there used to be for having regional tenants are no longer valid. So one tenant is the way to go. So with classic on-premise, what you used to do is to have a physical topology, a fixed topology. You would have multiple farms. Each farm would represent a region, and within there, the language would be at this towards the bottom of the hierarchy, towards the bottom of the physical and of the logical hierarchy, the topology of the sites. If you use variations, language is necessarily at the bottom of the hierarchy. Now, what we have with Modern, with SharePoint Online, is a single tenant and a flexible logical topology. It's not a physical topology anymore. So you arrange sites in without much of a hierarchy around hubs, and there's no reason for the language to be at the bottom of that hierarchy. In fact, there's some very good reasons for it to go at the top of the hierarchy, that the top level sites have to be multilingual, have to think this through. From the point of view of how language is handled within SharePoint sites, in classic sites, site templates were very language specific. With modern sites, site templates are not language specific at all. They can handle lots of languages. By default, classic sites, when you created one, it was a single language. By default, when you create a modern site, all 50 languages are activated at once. On classic sites, you had variations with separate sites. With modern sites, now there are no variations. They're multilingual page publishing. Multilingual page publishing is not separate sites per language. It is necessarily all languages on the same site. I'm not going to talk about the dev aspect of it, but if you're a dev, you have to look at localization also at a different level, at the top level. So what are all the SharePoint Online multilingual language features? One of them is multilingual page publishing, I'm talking about there. Another one is variations. Variations is still there. It's deprecated. It's still there. It doesn't apply to modern sites. Never did, never will. There is a machine translation service, also deprecated. It doesn't work for modern. It's still there. The API works, the term store works, but you can't use it for anything else. You can't use it for variations anymore to translate sites. The manage metadata handles language. You can localize manage metadata, and there's a new version of the interface that does the localization in a different way. And the biggest thing is MUI, the multilingual user interface, which handles user interface elements. And I'm going to talk about it first. So let's start with a bad demo. Okay, prepare to be disappointed. I'm going to create a new site. Here, go to SharePoint. And I'm going to create a brand new site, and I'm going to use a feature that's been around for about a year, which is going to create an Arabic site, which is selecting the language of a site. Okay, so I'm going to choose Arabic as the language of the site. I hope some of you speak Arabic, because I don't understand Arabic. We're going to create a site. It's going to be in Arabic. I'm not going to understand a word of it. So let's go and have a look and see whether we can find our way around this Arabic site. So it's creating the site. And what happened? This Arabic site seems to be entirely in English. The site is in English. The navigation is in English. The content is in English. Document library, let's have a look. Document library, everything's in English. Site contents, everything's in English. What is going on here? So if I go to the page library, suddenly to the site pages, suddenly I see, the account name is in Arabic. So very disappointing demo. I tried to create a site in Arabic and it turned out to be all in English. So what went wrong? So what happens is that when you create a modern site from a modern site template, the site has a language, but it adapts to all languages. It automatically has all of the languages activated. And all the user interface elements are going to follow the user's language preference. My language preference was English, and therefore it was showing me everything that it could in the user interface in English. The page content in modern sites is rendered dynamically. So when you create a site from a template, the template itself doesn't have a lot of character strings. It goes to look them up in other SharePoint objects, generates them, renders them dynamically, and they render, so that gives it the ability to render that site entirely in the user's language, the user interface elements. The initial page content, the hero web part sample text, also is not stored within the ASPX file. You have a home.aspx file that it creates. That is an empty container which goes and fetches the information, and that information is entirely localizable, so it goes to get it in whatever is the language of the user. So why do you get to choose the language of your site if it works in every language? Well, there's some internal lists and library names that are going to be different. That's really not much of a help to anyone. It's really more of an inconvenience. If the user has no valid language set either in their browser or in their profile, they will see it in the default language. Okay. So that particular feature doesn't have a lot of use except with the new multilingual page publishing feature. So let's show that multilingual page publishing feature. I'll turn it on. I'll show you how to get some translators to translate pages, modify, delete, all that sort of good stuff. So I have a site that's already created. It's got very little content in it. It was created. It's unilingual. I'm going to go and turn on the feature. So the feature is not in the site features. It's over here in the language settings. So we'll go to the language settings. And there's this new thing in the language settings, if you've ever gone there, enable pages and news to be translated into multiple languages. So before we turn it on, we'll show you the old settings, which are still there. You create a site, all of the site languages are activated. They're all there. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to turn the feature on. And now there is a different way of entering languages. So there's English. I'll just turn it off for a second and show you what it's done. And in the advanced setting, it's the first thing that it does is it turns off all the alternate languages. So you will have more control over which alternate languages are going to be put in there. So I'm going to add, let's say, Chinese. I want Chinese traditional. Let's see, Chinese traditional. I get to select a translator. So who can translate Chinese traditional? Amy Wong can translate this. I'm going to add, say, German. So I add people as translators. That by itself does not give them any rights to the site. All that does is when you create a page and request a translation, it sends them an email. You have to give them rights to the site as something separate. I'll add, say, Irish, and I'm going to have Zap Brannigan. Okay, remember to go to the bottom and hit save. So we have English. We have 3 other languages. These get set as alternate languages, and they also get set as the languages to which you can request translations. So let's go to the home page. And let's request a translation on the home page. So there's this little thing here. It's called translation. And we're going to request a translation of the home page. So you'll get the translation panel. Translation of the home page is actually not translating, it's just creating a copy of the page. That page is still going to be in English. It's going to create a copy of that page for each of the languages that you select. You can create for all languages or one language at a time. So we'll create it for all the languages. And then we're going to add some news. We'll get to it to translating in a second, but first we will add a piece of news. When you create a page on a site, it's going to assume that that page is in English. You cannot create current content in any language other than the base language of the site. So I'm going to create a news item, changes to the travel policy. Maybe if I type this correctly, there will be no travel. Okay, so now I have a page. I can post it, or I can save it as a draft. But once I'm here, I have the translation panel, and I'm going to request translation. In this case, I'll just request it for Chinese. When I create it, what it's going to do, it's going to copy it in Chinese, and it's sending an email to Amy Wang. Amy Wang, sorry. Amy Wang is one of my classmates from high school. Amy Wang. Let's see, I've got her email here. So she has just gotten an email saying, changes to the travel policy, Chinese traditional translation requested. Okay, and there's a button here to start translating. So Amy is going to start translating. And the first thing that you see is she's been named as a translator, but I never gave her access to the site. Okay, just being named as a translator doesn't give you access to the site. So I will give Amy access to the site. Which access? If you just want her to translate pages, edit is enough. If you also want her to translate user interface elements, which you probably do, then she needs higher access. Okay, so I go back, I reload the page. Come on, come on. Okay, so and it says translate into Chinese, and there's this message here. This page has not been translated into Chinese. Edit to start translation. Okay, so it is up to Amy to edit the page, make the translation. So I don't speak Chinese. However, Amy speaks Cantonese, which is close enough. Which one is here? Okay, so I will. Come on. I'll just copy the whole thing. So I will go here. I'm editing the page. I'm not sure what this says, but I'm sure it's something similar. I will translate it here. Now, you will notice that all my user interface is still in English. So I'm changing the page to Chinese. However, and this is the Chinese page, you can see it here, ZH-CHT. This is the code for Chinese. It's been put into that folder. So I'm going to save that page, and this is now the Chinese page. So if I go here, so from the page, so if I want to see that Chinese version of the page rather than the English one, I have 4 or 5 different ways of doing it. So one of them is from the translation panel. I can go here, click on view, and it will bring me to that page. So the content is in Chinese, the user interface is still in English. There's another way to get there, which is if I look at this little drop down that shows me the available languages for this page. And it shows me whether it's draft or published. So I'm on the English, I can go and see the Chinese. So this is changing my preference for the content language that I want to see. It is not changing my preference for the user interface language. So I can go see this page, the Chinese version of the page. The other way that I can do it is I can go to the Pages library, and within the Pages library, it's created some folders. for the different languages that I have. And within those folders, there is the home page that I created in that language, and there is the change to the travel policy. So it's got the same file name in a different folder. Okay, so there's one other way to get to that page, and that's how people will normally get to that page. And that is if your user interface language is one of the languages of the site. So I'm going to make in Edge Chinese traditional as my preferred language, and then wherever I go on the site, I'm going to see not only Chinese user interface, but Chinese versions of pages. That's pretty cool. Okay, this redirection works most of the time. You'll figure out its quirks as to when it works, when it doesn't work. There are a number of things that you have to do to make sure that it works. One of them is it's very useful to have your content language be the same as your user interface language. User interface works. The other thing you have to do is whenever you create a translation and publish a translation, what you have to do is go back to the original page and republish it. Okay, and that will give you the link that will publish. It will have the pages recognize each other as to which is a translation of which. So you're changing some. Here I have. See, my redirection is not working because these two do not match. Okay. So the minute that I go and have the match, I go to the English one. What I have to do is republish or repost because I've changed some of the metadata, the pointers to the other page, and that won't be visible to others, and it won't be filterable until I republish. Filtering is another cool thing that it does. So if you have a news web part or a highlighted events web part, here I see changes to the travel policy. All I'm seeing here is the English version. If I were to go to the Chinese version of this page, which is not yet translated, so it looks like it's in English, but this is actually the Chinese version of the homepage, then, and if I had actually published the page, then what I would see is a filtered version. So people whose language is Chinese will only see Chinese news. People whose language is English will only see English news. This works generally with on-site news. It also works with hub site news if the hub also has the multilingual property. Okay. So very nice feature, news and highlight content web part. This is automatic filtering. This isn't a filter property that you can turn on and off and change. This comes with the feature is that the news web part automatically filters by language if there's a version in your language. If you edit a translated original, then what will happen is it will send an email to the translator, but it's not the same as the original one. It won't resync. So this is where it's very useful to use the new feature that shows you visually the difference between different versions of the page. So if you change the original, publish a new version, go and find the new feature, which is to compare versions so the translator can see what has changed and make that change in the translated page. If you delete a target page, deleting a target page works nicely. So if I go to my target page, this is all in Chinese, so I don't see it. Haha. I'm going to change my I'm going to change my language back to English just so that I can see this better. Okay, so now I want to go to the changes to the travel policy, and I'm going to delete the translated version. What happens when you delete the translated version? The original behaves well in that when you go to the original page, in English, this is what happens when I don't follow my script. And I look here, Chinese isn't there. If I look at the translation, the Chinese isn't there. I get to create one if I want to. Okay, so it reacts well to deleting the translation. It does not react well to deleting the original and leaving the translation. So it's better to delete the translation first, then delete the original if you want to delete. Okay, let's see a few things to remember from the demo, see if I went through everything. This works for communication sites. It does not work for all modern sites. It does not work for team sites. It only works for modern pages, the site pages library on the modern site. If you have classic pages somehow on that site, it's not going to work for that. The default language of the site is presumed to be the language of new pages. The alternate languages on a site now serve two purposes. They serve the purpose of the MUI, and they serve the purpose of the page translation targets. So the list of languages to which you can request translation. So it's the same list for the two. You have to give translators rights. Translation panel will copy the pages, but you have to find someone who is going to translate those pages, someone who has edit rights and can translate those pages. Several different ways to see the translated pages. If you update a page, translators get another email. If you delete a translated page, you have to go back to the original page and republish. It's always a good idea, whatever change you do, republish the original every time. One of the things which I did not show you is while I was in Chinese, this does not do anything directly for the user interface. So I had something in here which is working from home, and that is not translated to Chinese. That's a customization. That's something that I provided to them. So if I am the translator, I also have to edit the MUI while my UI language is the target language, and make any changes here to the text, change it to whatever is the Chinese version. Okay, that only affects what shows up in Chinese. That doesn't affect what shows up in English. So this is how you translate the MUI, and that applies to, I'll talk a little more about MUI in a second. This is the version history, which is now available. You can see visually when a page has been changed, what has been changed. So that's a good way for translators to know what they have to change to the translated version in order to match the changes to the original. I was changing my language using my browser language preference. That is not the usual way to change your language, but there are lots and lots of there's a complex interplay of parameters that together determine what the user interface language is going to be. So every SharePoint site has got a base language, and you can have alternate languages Whether it's a classic or modern or this feature or not this feature, there are alternate languages in addition to the base language. So which one is going to be used? All other things being equal, and remember, the other things are never equal. All other things being equal, it's going to use the browser language. Browser language, every browser has a ranked list of languages that it supports. So you give it the list in your browser and go through it one by one. And the first one that matches one of these, that's going to be the user interface language for that user. But what normally happens is that you have in your profile, you also have a ranked list of languages, and this will override your browser language. So if you have in your Office 365 profile a language set, it's going to go through that list of languages first to see if any of those match. If none of them match, then it goes through this list. If none of those match, then it uses the base language. But that's not all, because the Office 365 account also has a language. And if you change that language, that is going to cascade down and change your user profile language as well. So if you make this change here, it's going to change whatever you had stored there before. Not the other way around, just in this direction. The user profile language list is also synchronized with Azure Active Directory, which can be synchronized using AD Direct with your Azure Direct. So you can set it beforehand, but also you can change it using your profile. This is not what actually is affecting the language, because when you do that, you get a message saying that it will take about 10 minutes. So there is in the background a timer synchronization with every single site. Every single site remembers each user's language preference, and this has to be synchronized from this list whenever there's a change. There's an additional set of wrinkles if you're using classic apps, but you're not, right? You're not? No one's doing that? Yeah, okay. So the profile language settings, that's a simple 11-step process. So in order to get to it, you click on your photo in the upper right hand, you click on My Office Profile, Update Profile, then scroll down. There's something that says, how can I change language and regional settings? Expand that, click on the word Here. Then you will find a page that looks like this. You click on the 3 dots in order to see language and region. Then you see this list in My Display Languages. You can pick a new language. The vast majority of the languages that it offers you are languages that it doesn't actually support. So pick wisely. There's some sort of mapping between different variants of the languages, but you also get languages like Mohawk and Upper Sorbian and so forth, which it doesn't support at all. I'm not sure why they're being offered as options. So you can get your rank list here, scroll down to the bottom, save, alt, and close. It's going to give you a message saying that it's going to take a while. So typically 10 minutes later, this will start to take effect. What I was doing was the instant toggle trick. This trick means your account settings. If you can, you have an account setting that doesn't overlap with the base and alternate languages. But really more importantly is step 3, your profile setting. Remove all the languages. Just leave that blank. Go home, come back, because there's some synchronization going on. And when you come back, then your browser settings are what determine what the user interface language is going to be. So that trick is fine to use, fine to give power users who have to change their language often. This is certainly not something that you're going to use to teach end users to do. They're not going to do it. Just finding the browser settings is very difficult. But it's a trick that you can use when you're testing out these sorts of features. Let's talk about the MUI, the multilingual user interface. So there are lots of SharePoint UI elements that can follow the user's language. There are certain third-party components that can follow UI language as well. It's possible to have SPFX app parts that will use the user's language in order to display different things in different languages. Manage metadata can follow the user's language. Content doesn't follow the user language. Content is always whatever the content is on that page. So MUI is, as the name implies, just for user interface. So the language of content, language of user interface, two completely different things in SharePoint. If you add any new user interface elements, you have to provide the translations. Most of the built-in user interface elements, standard navigation and so forth, SharePoint has already provided translations for that. Anything new that you add, you have to provide translations. So MUI elements, these are the names, titles, and descriptions of sites, navigation nodes, including hub navigation. Hub navigation supports MUI. It doesn't look like it does, but that's just because it's got a long caching. Change it, come back the next day, you'll see that it works. List names, column names, content type names, list views, custom actions in many cases, if you're still using those. If you're using classic web part names are MUI enabled, modern ones are not. So you can do that manually simply by changing your language and then editing the text. So you find the place where you can change the title, the name, the description, and you just enter it while you're in that language. And that will only affect the text that shows up in your language, right? It will not affect the text that shows up in other languages. If you want to do it programmatically, there are some ways to do it. The API doesn't cover all the UI elements. It covers most of them, doesn't cover them all. There's a complicated way of doing this to export a resource file that contains most of the MUI element strings. But this non-programmers can't help you there. You have to use Visual Studio to edit that. Okay, let's move on to the Manage Metadata interface. So this is something which is cool, which is new. There's a brand new interface which is rolling out right now, or will roll out very soon. I'm not quite sure. I don't have it yet, but I've heard that others do. So when you are managing the term store using the current interface, the taxonomy term, you get to select the language at the very top of the hierarchy, and then you can edit the strings just for that language. So the managed metadata can have one string in one language, a different string in a different language. There is also a cool translation feature where you can send an entire branch of managed metadata to machine translation, and it comes back already translated. The translations are usually pretty good, but check them. There's a new interface for managed metadata, and it changes where the language feature is. So everything is still localized in all the languages that you want to support in the managed metadata service. This is not the same thing as the language that you choose for the sites. This is a separate set of languages that you choose for managed metadata. And there, the languages are at the bottom. So you navigate to the item first, and then you can see the English version, the French version. You can edit it in, add synonyms in different languages. So that's cool. Something else which has just come out is there is going to be a Graph API. This is pretty exciting. Graph API to cover managed metadata. So there's documentation for that API that's out. The API itself isn't. All right, so what does all of that mean for governance? Well, if you're dealing with managed metadata, if you're dealing with content types, things that tend to be inherited by different sites anyway, you can centralize that on a content type hub. You can centralize managed metadata. That's the way it is right now. You can centralize it, and if you do, you had better have the translation centralized, right? This is only the people that have access to the managed metadata service, the term stores, will have access to it. So they're the ones who are responsible for providing the translations. When it comes to user interface, every modern site is potentially multilingual. So from a government's point of view, you have to put your thinking about the governance of who provides those user interface element translations into every site. Unless you turn off the alternate languages, it's going to be visible to people of that language. So you have to determine what you want people who have a language preference other than whatever the default one is are going to see, and who's going to provide those translations. When you're using hubs, hubs have hub navigation. Hub navigation should always be translated because there are sites that are in different languages that might want to join that hub. Okay, so in that case, hub navigation will appear in other languages. Hubs can also aggregate news. If you're going to aggregate news, you'll have news in different languages. It's always a good idea to think through who's going to see which news in which language. And if you have this feature enabled, then that does automatic filtering. If you don't, you can find other ways to filter according to language, as long as you declare what is the language of each news item that you create. For the content, if you're using classic sites, you still have to use variations. If you're using modern sites, you'll have to figure out the governance of the translation. Who's going to provide that translation? So by default, what happens with this new feature is on every site, you decide who is the translator, and you give that translator access, and you hope that that translator will, when they receive the email, actually carry out the translation. One of the nice things which is coming very soon is scheduling of news posts. So you can determine that rather than publishing the English one, then asking translators to provide translations, you will schedule all versions in all languages to become available at the same time. Localization can't be left to regions anymore. Localization is now a headquarters problem. You have to think it through. You have to determine a strategy. And whenever somebody is responsible for generating content, for generating tests, somebody has to be responsible for the translation. So how do you do that? Well, you need a policy, decide what needs translating and when it needs to be translated. Does it need to be translated at the same time, or are you going to translate some things later? You need to decide the level of quality. So there are machine translation options, or you can use your own internal staff. Your own internal staff are not professional translators, so the translation quality is not going to be as good. Or you can use professional translators. So decide for each type of content, what is the quality that is good enough, and then figure out whether the people who generate the original are going to be responsible for the translation being done. And in a lot of projects that I've done, there's some pushback. So for instance, in one case, they wanted to support 6 languages, and the people in communication said, we are now responsible for 6 times as many documents as we were responsible for before, 5/6 of which we can't even read, but it is our responsibility. And in particular, because it's on the same site, it's not on a separate site, you can't really parcel out responsibility to different people. So the people who generate content will, whether they like it or not, have some responsibility for making sure that the translations are created, that they are deleted when they need to be deleted, modified, archived, whatever. So each of these documents, each of these translations has an independent life cycle. If you change the original, it does not automatically affect the translations. Somebody has to make sure that the same thing is repeated to, same action is repeated to all the translations. So what you get in the end is a type of collaborative governance. Oh, so there's also some people who like to translate selectively. Personally, I think that's a bad idea to translate on request. That means that people are always having to complain about what's missing, and they have to figure out what's missing. It's always better to translate by policy, to have a fixed policy so that everyone knows whether something will be translated or not. So you get a sort of collaborative governance. You can't just have a governance of content generators. There's the content consumers are also stakeholders in this, and particularly the ones who consume it in a different language. So there's a sort of collaborative effort where you determine what their needs are and you give them a stake in the process. Okay, Teams. Teams has a bunch of interesting language features, but Teams have separate language features from SharePoint. Teams has an independent language setting. You can go to Teams, every user can determine their language in Teams. This is separate from their language preference in most other Office 365 products, and in particular it's different from SharePoint. So your language preference is kept separately for Teams, and that language preference will control the UI language. It does not control the content language. So it's possible to have a tab which is language sensitive because it comes from SharePoint, but the language of that tab will determine on the language rules. So your SharePoint settings and the alternate language settings of the team site, which is associated with the teams, with the team. That's hard to say, right? The SharePoint team site. So the SharePoint team site determines the language of the content, whereas the Teams UI setting will determine the UI language for Teams. There's a very neat feature which is off by default, but you can just go and turn it on, which is called Translate Messages. So you go to the message properties and turn on message translation. What will happen is that within a chat, you get to translate individual text. You can in your context menu, you see translate showing up. I didn't show this here because you're possibly seeing it right now. Within Teams live events, you can have translation as well. That's a feature which is in Teams live events. You can have a simultaneous translation of what I say. You can go to a URL, you can have an app on your phone, and every word that I say, you can see it in Danish or whatever other language you set. So there are lots of features in Teams to make sure that all members of your teams throughout the world can understand what's going on, can consume content in their own language. All right, let's talk a little about machine translation. There are lots and lots of new machine translation features that are in all sorts of Microsoft 365 products, and people scoff at them because machine translation has a reputation for being poor. This is a package of Polish sausage that I picked up at a store a couple of years ago. It says Polish sausage in English. I'm in Canada. It also says polissez la saucisse. The French says buff the sausage. So this is a machine translation where it thought it was Polish sausage. What's even funnier is down here, best before, the French is mieux auparavant, which means it used to be better. Okay, so it is entirely possible for machine translation to give you poor or even embarrassing results. And in fact, this was the norm until recently. It is still the norm for a lot of the free machine translation products like Google Translate. However, there's much better technology available. Bing uses it in the free product. Google does not yet. You have to pay extra for the good quality translation. And Azure has all sorts of great machine translation API that use the best neural translation engine. So Microsoft has leapfrogged most other players in terms of the quality of the translation. It has in several languages reached human parity. Human parity means that in blind tests, people don't know When they rate the quality of translations, they don't rate the quality of machine translation any lower than the quality of human translation. Mind you, these humans are not professional translators. These are amateur translators, graduate students, and that sort of thing who participate in this. But still, human parity is there. It is in production, has been for a year for several languages. There's superhuman, that is to say, better than the quality of the average human being. That is coming. It's there in German. It's coming for some of the others. There are, I think, 9 languages in which we have human parity. There are also all sorts of APIs where you can retrain the neural machine translation model using your own vocabulary. So it adopts your style, it adopts your own vocabulary. It increases the level of quality even more. When it comes to speech translation, there is some brand new technology that uses end-to-end speech translation. So speech to text, then text translation, then text to speech, and the 3 end-to-end are optimized together to provide a high quality of translation. And that is now there for several different languages. Okay, so this is all that I had. This is about the time that I have. This is great. Thank you for joining us. Consider donating to the following charities. If you have any questions, I can take them here. Or you can find me later on, either in the community area, or more likely at the Point Fire booth. You can come and talk to me, or send me an email, send me a Twitter.
Well, that's a great session, Martin.
Thank you.
Good stuff. I really liked it. There's a lot of interesting things, and we were actually hoping for this for a long time, and I think a lot of customers are going to be very happy to get this stuff in their hands pretty soon.
It addresses a part of the overall problem, but the part that it does address, it addresses well. So
okay, that's a good nuance answer.
The rest may be coming. You still have some work to do. It's not as automatic as people were hoping it would be, but it is a solution where there was none before.
Clear. So people watching the live stream, feel free to put a question in the questions and answer component of this live stream. Martin might still be around for a couple of minutes to answer your questions. So be happy to do so. In about 10 minutes, we will be having the second keynote, actually, which will be, let me check. Wow, it's Naomi Moneypenny and Chris McNulty, which are going to talk about knowledge and knowledge management regarding Project Cortex and Microsoft's 365 vision regarding that product. So for now, Martin, I would like to thank you for this great presentation.
It's my pleasure.
Good stuff. And again, if you have a question, if people don't have a question right now because they're watching this video later on, is there a way to reach you?
Yes.
Or do you use Twitter?
I use Twitter, and I forgot to put. Well, just name it. It's called Tono Bungay, which is not very memorable. It's the name of H.G. Wells' novel, Tono Bungay, T-O-N-O.
Okay.
I think it's in the very first slide.
If people will search for that,
it's in the very first slide.
Yeah, that will be good. Okay, so again, thank you. Loved your talk. Good stuff. Pretty sure most people will like that very much.